Did you really think I'd go down with you? Take your mess and get out of my sight.
The moment she finished speaking, the fiancé tore the 5-carat engagement ring from her finger and threw it straight at the man's chest. Under the freezing winter rain of Philadelphia, the diamond bounced once and sank into a black puddle of mud. The mansion door slammed shut with a sharp crack. She turned her back and walked away, leaving him there with a crumpled newspaper reporting that his corporation had just collapsed. She had no idea that the collapse was only a trap, and she had no idea that tonight's storm would push this hidden billionaire to the door of a rundown apartment building, where an exhausted single mother was fighting to survive and where she was about to teach the elite a costly lesson about dignity. The mid-December rain in Philadelphia lashed down on the main line as if it wanted to tear through every lit window behind the black iron gates. On the marble steps in front of Chloe's family mansion, Julian Vance stood motionless in a soaked silk shirt, his black hair hanging over his forehead, rain running down his cheekbones and dripping from his crooked tie. At his feet, the leather suitcase that had just been thrown onto the stone steps had burst open, and his neatly pressed shirts were sliding through dead leaves, black mud, and cold water. Chloe stood behind the door, dry, beautiful, and completely without mercy. Her pearl-colored silk nightgown wrapped around her body like something displayed behind glass. In her hand was a crumpled financial newspaper, the front page carrying a bold headline about Vance Global facing bankruptcy risk and the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission beginning an investigation. Then the 5-carat diamond ring flew from Chloe's hand. It struck Julian in the chest, bounced once with a cold little sound, then fell into the water beneath his shoes. Chloe looked at him the way someone looks at an investment that has lost value. Her voice was calm enough to be cruel as she said she could not attach her family's brand to a failure and that he should never call her again. Only the sound of the electronic lock followed after the oak door slammed shut, cutting off 2 years of engagement wrapped in champagne and prenup contracts. On the other side of the door, music inside the house started again very softly, as if Chloe's private party had never been interrupted by a human being thrown out into the rain. Julian heard laughter mixed with thunder, and for the first time in years, he understood that loneliness did not always come from poverty. It could stand right in front of a brightly lit mansion, wearing a tailored suit, holding an engagement ring covered in mud. Julian bent down and picked up the muddy ring. The entire collapse, the asset freeze, and the SEC investigation were all part of a trap he had set to force the traders on his board to dump their shares and expose themselves. But there was one part of the plan that wasn't fake. He truly wanted to know who Chloe would choose when power and money no longer stood behind him. The answer had just been thrown straight at his chest, along with the ring. He pushed the ring into the pocket of his wet pants, raised the collar of his mud-stained jacket, and stepped down onto the flooded street. The secret security system had disabled his bank cards, his personal phone number, and every backup method so the performance would have no cracks. For the next 30 days, Julian Vance would disappear from his own world like a man with nothing. He had once thought it was only a cold experiment until the rain soaked through every layer of expensive fabric. Almost 10 miles away at a rough intersection in West Philadelphia, Maya Caldwell had just finished a 14-hour shift at Elora Bridal. The boutique's back door closed behind her, leaving behind the smell of expensive perfume, satin fabric, and the contempt still clinging to her black uniform. White silk threads covered the hem of her clothes. Her hands were swollen and red, with bandages wrapped around her fingertips after spending the whole day kneeling on the stone floor, pinning wedding dress hems for rich brides. Maya knew nothing about those financial schemes. To her, tonight only had one small calculation. Get home before Leo woke up, keep her son warm enough, and hope Susan would still let her borrow a few dollars in the morning to buy medicine. But that cold city rarely allowed poor people to make plans in peace. Maya pulled her ash-gray wool coat tight around herself and walked toward the night bus stop. Her old phone showed 1:07 a.m. She looked at the cracked screen, then checked her bank balance before quickly turning it off. There were a few cents left. In her bag was the bill for Leo's heart medicine. Her son was only 7 years old, with a weak heart, lips that often turned pale, and medicine at home that would only last if she kept cutting the dose smaller. The wind moved through the rusty bus shelter, carrying the smell of wet trash, exhaust, and backed-up sewage. Maya was about to walk home when she heard a very soft cough from the dark corner of the metal bench. At first, she thought it was a drunk man. But when she looked closer, the man did not look like someone used to the street. The suit on his body had once been very expensive, but now it was soaked and sticking to him. His head hung low, his shoulders shook in bursts, and his lips were turning blue under the flickering yellow light. Maya stopped, her hand tightening around the strap of her cloth bag. She had no money for a cab. She had no empty space in her life for more trouble. Leo was waiting for her at home. Medicine money was missing. Rent was late. She took 2 steps away, then the man coughed hard, a dry, rough sound pulled from his chest and his body tipped sideways, his forehead hitting the metal bar of the bench. That sound made Maya stop. It was enough to send an image of Leo clutching his chest and gasping for breath through her mind. She turned around fast, rushed to the bench, and put a hand on the man's shoulder. The fabric of his suit was as cold as if it had been pulled from a bucket of ice. She called to him, asking if he could hear her. His eyelids opened slightly, his eyes exhausted but strangely alert. Maya took off her wool coat. The cold immediately cut through her thin uniform, biting at her neck and both arms. She wrapped the coat around his shoulders, pulled the 2 sides close-stand, then slid her arms under his to help him. He was heavier than she expected. She told him this bus route was not running anymore, that if he kept sitting there, he would freeze to death, and that her apartment was 4 blocks away. When he said in a hoarse voice that his name was Jules, Maya only nodded. They dragged themselves through flooded alleys, past closed storefronts, overturned trash cans, and windows taped against the wind. Maya's apartment was on the 4th floor of an old red brick building, where the wooden stairs creaked under every step. She opened the door very quietly, afraid to wake her son. The apartment was so small that Julian could see almost her entire life just by standing in the entryway. A torn leather sofa sat against the wall beside a narrow kitchen and a ceiling with peeling paint from water damage. But everything had been cleaned carefully and arranged with heartbreaking neatness. On a twin bed in the corner, Leo lay curled under a thin blanket, his small chest rising and falling unevenly, his lips pale as paper. Maya immediately pulled the blanket up to his neck, placed the back of her hand against his forehead, and only then turned back to the stranger. She handed Julian a faded gray hoodie and told him to change out of the wet clothes and put them in the blue plastic basin. Julian obeyed in silence. The Tom Ford suit worth several $1,000s lay flat at the bottom of the basin like a useless, expensive rag. From the kitchen corner, Maya turned on the old microwave. It hummed as it spun, its small yellow light flickering across her tired face. A few minutes later, she placed a plate of spaghetti with canned tomato sauce on the table. It was leftover food from a convenience store, worth less than $3. The steam rising from it made the room feel less cold. Maya pushed the plate toward Julian and told him to eat so he could warm up. She said she had already eaten at work because the VIP guests had ordered a lot of food. Her stomach made a soft sound at the exact moment she turned away to find a towel. Julian held the plastic fork and divided the spaghetti into 2 portions. He pushed the larger half toward her. Maya was about to refuse, but he said his stomach was not feeling right, and if she did not help, that part would go to waste. He said it softly, not like someone giving charity, but like a person asking to protect a little dignity for the one in front of him. Maya stood still for a few seconds, then took another fork. A billionaire the whole world believed was bankrupt, and a single mother who did not have enough money for medicine shared 1 cheap plate of spaghetti. The night deepened. Maya laid a thin blanket over him on the sofa, then returned to Leo's bed. Julian closed his eyes but did not sleep. He heard the pipes leaking inside the wall, the old heater breathing weakly, the wind whistling through the window gap, and Leo wheezing with each breath. Around 3:30 in the morning, the child's breathing changed. Maya sat up at once, as if her body had been trained by fear. Leo clutched his chest, his face going pale, his lips moving without forming clear words. Maya lifted him gently, speaking in a very soft voice to calm him, while her hand reached quickly for the medicine bottle on top of the cabinet. Maya shook the bottle. The plastic clicking sound came out dry and hollow. At the bottom, only 2 blue pills remained. She took out 1 pill, placed it on the plastic cutting board, and pressed down carefully with a dull butter knife. The pill split in half. 1 half was crushed into a cup of warm water, and she patiently helped Leo drink it sip by sip. The other half was wrapped in a small piece of tissue and placed back at the bottom of the bottle like something more precious than gold. Julian turned his face toward the back of the sofa, his hand tightening under the blanket. He did not need a doctor to explain what it meant. She was stretching her son's life by cutting down something that should never have been cut. And only a few hours earlier, she had taken off her only coat to save a stranger at a bus stop. Near dawn, Julian sat up and folded the old blanket neatly. Maya had fallen asleep beside Leo's bed, one hand still resting on her son's chest as if she were counting every heartbeat. Julian moved quietly toward the door, intending to call the satellite phone hidden inside the lining of his suit jacket. His test had gone far enough. He would break the rule, unlock the private line, transfer money to Maya, take Leo to the best hospital, and return to his own war. But his hand stopped in front of the yellow paper taped to the door with silver tapes. It was a debt collection notice. Flight scene $200 had to be paid within 72 hours. Julian looked at that number so long that the paper blurred in front of him. At that exact moment, Maya's flip phone rang on the kitchen table. She startled awake and grabbed it before Leo could wake up. But the old speaker burst out with a sharp, cold female voice. Susan, the owner of Allura Bridal, screamed that a VIP client had a dress fitting at 3 p.m. Maya was not allowed to be even 1 minute late, and if she ruined a single bead, she would be fired immediately. Then her voice dropped lower, more poisonous, threatening that a single mother with no income could lose custody of her child. Maya stood beside the sink, one hand holding the phone, the other gripping the edge of the rusted stainless steel counter. She asked for a small advance so she could buy medicine for her son, but the person on the other end had already hung up. Maya lowered her head, her shoulders shaking, but she did not cry out loud. A mother at the bottom of society sometimes does not have the right to break down when her child is still breathing in the same room. Julian stood in the doorway, his hands still near the satellite phone. With one call, he could pay off every debt and crush Susan before lunch. But if he did that now, Maya would only see a rich man who had lied and used money to step on her pride. He pulled his hand away from the lining of the jacket. The phone slipped deeper into the pocket. He turned back toward the kitchen, looked at the leaking pipe under the sink, then at the old heater breathing weak warmth into the room. Julian said he was unemployed and had no money to pay for the meal or the coat from last night, but he knew how to fix a few things around the house. If she needed, he could stay, repair for the pipe, clean the heater, and watch Leo to pay back what he owed. Maya looked up, her eyes still read suspicion across her face. The apartment stayed silent for a few seconds, with only water dripping into the bucket under the... Finally, she gives a very small nod, and in that moment, Julian Vance, heir to a $3.6 billion empire, officially became Jules, the broke handyman with not a penny in his pocket, staying on the 4th floor of an old apartment building in West Philadelphia. Outside, the storm had not cleared, but in the cold kitchen, he had just decided to pay his first debt with his bare hands. During the first 3 days in the 4th floor apartment, Julian learned again how to do the things money had always solved for him. He removed the rotten board under the sink and used a rusty wrench Maya had borrowed from a neighbor to tighten the pipe that had been leaking for months. Maya left him a note with Leo's medicine times, the school phone number, and a warning not to let the boy run no matter how much he begged. Her handwriting looked like it had been written by someone always rushing back between 2 shifts. Julian was still Julian Vance, CEO of Vance Global, but in the eyes of this apartment building, he was only Jules. He was only Jules, a tall man fixing pipes in exchange for a place to sleep. His assets were still technically frozen in the 30-day operation he had approved himself. Inside the company, the board had started dumping shares. Several executives were secretly moving money through shell funds, and his legal team was quietly recording every trace. That plan had once made Julian proud because of its cold perfection. But when Leo coughed dryly on the weak bed behind him, that perfection sounded more like a cruel game than a strategy. Leo could not run for long. Just walking from the bed to the window made him place both hands on the back of a chair to breathe. Julian cut a piece of cardboard into the shape of a spaceship, taped it to the top of a mop handle, then carried Leo on his back around the 4th floor hallway as if they were on an expedition. The boy wrapped his small arms around Julian's neck and whispered the names of planets in a breathless voice. Neighbors opened their doors a crack and looked out. An elderly Puerto Rican woman at the end of the hall handed Julian 2 cold empanadas without asking where he had come from. At night, Maya came home with the smell of satin, expensive perfume, and dry bleach clinging to her uniform. She took her shoes off right beside the door so she would not dirty the floor, then stood still for a few seconds before bending down to kiss Leo's forehead. Some nights her feet hurt so badly that she had to hold the wall when she walked into the kitchen. Julian saw the soles of her shoes peeling open like fish mouths. She sewed them back together with black thread under the flickering fluorescent light, the old needle wounds on her fingertips opening into new ones. She did not complain. She only blew softly on her finger, wiped the blood with a tissue, and kept sewing, as if those shoes were not just for going to work, but for keeping the whole home standing one more day. The feelings between them did not come through promises. They came through things so small that anyone watching from the outside could easily miss them. Julian learned how warm Leo liked his milk. Maya left more noodles in his bowl and pretended she was not hungry. He fixed the kitchen cabinet door, and she placed a thicker blanket beside the sofa, even though she still curled up in a thin sweater. When Leo slept, they sat across from each other at the scratched wooden table and talked about ordinary things. A clean seam, an old neighborhood, Maya's mother who had died, and Julian's father who had always called emotion a weakness in negotiation. Maya did not know he was rich. She also had no reason to suspect it. The man in front of her knew how to fix pipes, wash dishes carefully, and carry a child with a weak heart so gently that she never had to remind him. Sometimes he looked at the financial news on the small screen at the corner store for too long, his eyes sharpening in a way that did not fit an ordinary unemployed man. But Maya did not have time to investigate other people's secrets. On Friday morning, Susan called Maya into Laura Bridal earlier than scheduled. The boutique was in Rittenhouse Square, with tall glass windows and soft golden light inside, like a jewelry showroom. White wedding dresses hung along the walls, each one costing as much as 6 months of Maya's rent. She entered through the back door, changed into her black apron, pinned a box of needles to her wrist, and knelt down to check the hem of a dress for an important fitting. Susan walked past and reminded her not to let the smell of the subway cling to the imported Italian fabric. Near noon, Chloe walked in with 3 women and a private photographer. She wore a cream fur coat, sunglasses, even though the sky outside was gray, and a new ring that flashed on her hand. Rumors of her sudden engagement to a young investor had already spread through the upper class. Chloe walked past Maya without recognizing her right away. To her, the people kneeling on the floor to adjust dresses did not have individual faces. They were like soft tools moving around the shoes of VIP customers. Susan nearly bent herself in half while greeting Chloe. Her voice was so sweet, it seemed to stick in the air. Chloe chose the most expensive dresses on the room, the kind with thousands of tiny train, almost 3 meters long. When Maya knelt to adjust the lining around the hem, she recognized Chloe's perfume. It was the same scent that had clung to Jules's wet jacket on the first night. She looked up very quickly, but Chloe had already turned toward the mirror, smiling at her own reflection. The fitting lasted more than 2 hours. Maya had to kneel on the cold stone floor and pin each fold of fabric around Chloe's ankles. Her knees ached, her back tightened, but she kept her hands steady because one wrong pin could make Susan take money from her pay. Chloe kept complaining that the lower fabric made her look heavy, that the workers' hands were too slow, and that a high-end boutique should have cleaner-looking staff. Every sentence was dropped lightly, like powder falling onto fabric, but it stuck to Maya's skin more painfully than shouting. When Maya reached to adjust the lace near Chloe's heel, Chloe suddenly shifted her foot. The satin heel came straight down on the back of Maya's hand. Pain shot up to her elbow, but Maya only froze, her lips pressed tight. Chloe looked down, a small, cold smile crossing her face. She said maybe the shop should remind its staff not to foot if they did not want to be treated like an obstacle. Susan rushed over at once, not to ask if Maya was hurt. She apologized to Chloe, then turned to Maya with a look that could have skinned her alive. The bruise rose quickly across the back of Maya's hand. She bit the inside of her cheek so no sound would come out. Susan pulled her into the back storage rooms where the smell of nylon fabric, cardboard boxes, and tailor's chalk filled the air. She said Maya had upset a VIP client, damaged the store's reputation, and that half a month of her wages would be held back to cover customer care costs. Maya looked at the payroll calendar taped to the storage wall. Half a month's wages was Leo's heart medicine. She opened her mouth to ask Susan to reconsider, leaving only a warning that a single mother should not act as if she had choices. That afternoon, Maya kept working with a swollen purple hand. She did not dare ask to leave early. Every time she bent down to pick up a fallen needle, she had to use her left hand to brace herself on the floor. In her pocket, her phone buzzed 3 times with messages from Julian. Leo is okay. He ate soup. He is listening to a story about Mars. The 4th message was a photo sleeping on the sofa, his cheek resting against the cardboard spaceship, then locked at the picture for a few seconds, then locked the screen before Susan could see. Sometimes a gentle image can weaken a person at the exact moment they need to be strongest. At home, Julian had repaired the heater enough to make the room a little warmer. He removed the dust-packed filter and scrubbed each metal slot with an old brush. Leo sat on a chair, swinging his legs, and asked if Jules had ever lived in a palace. Julian smiled and said some houses were very large but colder than this apartment. Leo thought about that very seriously, then said that people in those houses should buy more blankets. The child's words made Julian turn his face away. That evening, Maya came home 1 hour late. She hid her injured hand in her coat pocket, but Leo saw it when she bent down to hug him. The boy asked if it hurt. Maya said it was just a needle prick, something normal for a seamstress. Julian stood by the kitchen, his eyes stopping on the blue-purple bruise. He did not ask in front of Leo. He waited until the boy was asleep, then placed a warm bowl of soup in front of Maya. She ate a few spoonfuls and finally told him about Chloe, about Susan cutting her wages, about the medicine money. Her voice was so even it was frightening. Poor people often learn to describe disaster like they are describing the weather because they still have to go to work the next day. Julian sat across from her, his hand resting on the old table. Under his skin, every wire of control inside him pulled tight. Chloe had thrown him out because she thought he was broke. Now she had used the same shoe to step on the hand of the woman who had saved his life. He wanted to call lawyers, call security, call the full force of Vance Global, and crush that boutique before the night ended. But the operation was still not finished. His backup accounts had been disabled to avoid leaks. The traders on the board had not all exposed themselves yet. And in front of him was Maya, a woman who would not accept being turned into a rescue project so a stranger could prove his power. That night, Leo did not sleep well. At first, it was only a small cough. Maya placed her hand on his chest, as she did every night. But near midnight, the boy suddenly curled into himself, both hands gripping the left side of his chest, his breath coming in sharp pulls. Maya jumped up, and the medicine bottle slipped from her hand and rolled under the bed. Julian dropped to his knees to find it, hearing her call her son's name in a voice trying to stay calm, but breaking at the end of every sentence. When he finally brought the bottle up, there was only half a pill left at the bottom, wrapped in tissue. They called 911 from Maya's flip phone. The ambulance arrived after 11 minutes, but to Maya, those 11 minutes felt as long as winter. Julian carried Leo down the stairs because the stretcher could not turn through the tight bend on the 3rd floor. The boy was so light that it scared him. In the ambulance, Maya leaned forward, one hand holding her son's oxygen mask, the other gripping the edge of Julian's shirt, as if she feared that if she let go, both she and her child would fall out of the world. The public hospital on the west side of the city looked white and tired. Fluorescent lights poured down over rows of plastic chairs, while heart monitors beeped steadily behind green curtains. Leo was taken into the pediatric emergency area. Maya stood outside, her uniform still covered in white threads, her swollen hand clutching her purse. An administrative worker handed her a cost estimate after checking her insurance. The number $4,000 sat in the middle of the page like a wall. Maya stared at it so long that the employee had to ask if she needed to sit down. Julian stepped back into the hallway. At the end of the row was an old payphone for patients' families, its keypad worn down. He entered the code only he and his private secretary knew. After 3 rings, the voice of Harold Finch, his most loyal secretary, came through quietly. Julian said briefly that he needed to cancel part of the asset freeze and immediately transfer $10,000 to the hospital account under the name of a support fund. The other end was silent for a few seconds. Then Harold reported that the board had locked the last backup account after discovering an old access point. For the next 48 hours, Julian could not touch one legal dollar without collapsing the entire operation. Julian placed his hand against the glass wall of the phone booth. Across the hallway, he saw Maya sitting in a plastic chair, folding the bill in her hands so Leo would not see it if he woke up. A billionaire who had once controlled billion-dollar deals was standing less than 20 meters from her, but he could not pay the emergency bill for the child who had just called him Jules. He heard Harold ask if he wanted to break protocol. Julian watched Maya wipe the corner of her eye quickly with the back of her bruised hand, then closed his eyes. For the first time, only locked inside a system. It was locked right in his life. It was locked right in front of a child's pain, and the only key was trapped inside 48 hours that Leo's heart might not be strong enough to wait for. The next morning, Maya left the hospital while Philadelphia was still gray, like a wet sheet stretched across the buildings. Leo had made it through the danger for now, but the doctor made it clear that his medicine could not keep being split like that. The temporary hospital payment notice was clipped inside her coat pocket, its stiff edge rubbing against her skin every time she stepped down the hospital stairs. Julian walked beside her, still wearing the old hoodie, his eyes dark after a night spent sitting in the hallway. He wanted to say everything would be okay, but the words stuck Thespessing throat. To Maya, promises with no money, no prescription, and no hospital signature often sounded like wind slipping through a crack in the door. She did not go home right away. Maya took a bus to a small pawn shop on Market Street. In her cloth bag was her mother's old sewing machine, a heavy Singer with a black case, paint chipped at the corners, but still running smoothly like an old heart. Her mother had once used that machine to sew wedding dresses for neighbors, then left it to Maya as the only thing that could turn poor hands into food. The shop owner lifted the cover, looked it over carelessly, then named a price so low that Julian immediately clenched his hand. Maya did not bargain for long. She only asked if she could buy it back within 30 days. When the man nodded, she signed her name with her still swollen hand and took the wrinkled bills. That money went straight to the hospital counter. The administrative worker stamped the temporary payment onto the file and handed her a receipt with the face of someone used to watching people sell pieces of their lives for a few more days of treatment. Maya placed the receipt in her wallet, which was now almost completely empty. On the bus back to the apartment, she sat beside the window with her head resting against the cold glass. Julian saw that her eyes were closed, but she was not sleeping. People only sleep when the body believes it has permission to let go. Maya had never had that permission for more than a few minutes. When they got back to the apartment, Leo was still at the hospital for more monitoring, so the small room became too quiet. There was no little boy asking about Mars, no familiar wheezing breath, only water dripping into the bucket under the sink and the smell of old soup in the pot. Maya took off her shoes, walked into the kitchen, and counted the money left in her wallet. 4 $10 bills were smoothed flat on the table, then pushed toward Julian. She told him to take it and buy an old suit for job interviews. At least, she said, the apartment would still be there for a few more days, and he could not go looking for work in a torn hoodie. Julian looked at the $40 in front of him. The hand that had once signed billion-dollar acquisition contracts now trembled before 4 damp bills from a woman who had just sold her mother's keepsake to keep her son in the hospital. He did not touch the money right away. Maya thought he was embarrassed, so she folded the bills and then pressed them into his hand, the way someone places medicine into a child's pocket before they leave the house. Julian held that money for a long time. It was so light, it almost had no weight, but in his palm, it felt heavier than any investment he had ever controlled. He wanted to give it back. He wanted to tell the truth. He wanted to make one phone call and end all this suffering. But the operation was not finished. His assets were not unlocked. Leo still needed time, and Maya was still looking at him with the eyes of someone who believed he was trapped just like her. If he broke that trust with a confession right now, what he saved with money might kill the last piece of pride she was trying to hold on to. That afternoon, Maya returned to Laura Bridal. She entered through the back door with her hands still bruised purple, her sewing bag over her shoulder, and a uniform that had been washed clean but had a collar faded from wear. Susan was waiting in the storage room, her face tight with anger she had clearly prepared in advance. On the table was a small diamond clip used to attach to a VIP client's fitting dress. Chloe said it had disappeared during the fitting the day before. In a strange way, Susan did not need cameras, inventory checks, or questions for anyone else. She only needed to look Maya up and down, then decide where the story should end. Maya tried to explain that she had not touched the clip except when pinning the dress as asked. Susan did not listen. She said the Laura bridal served families whose names were on trust funds and could not allow an employee with complicated circumstances to damage the store's reputation. The phrase complicated circumstances landed softly, but it carried inside it everything Maya had tried to hide. A sick child, late rent, late shifts, bandaged fingers, and the smell of the subway on her uniform. Security was called as if Maya were a threat. A large man handed her a cardboard box and stood at the storage room door while she gathered a few personal items. An old measuring tape, a box of needles, a small pair of scissors with worn handles, and the pack of crackers Leo had once put in her bag for her. Susan stood behind him with her arms crossed, reminding Maya that she was not allowed to contact the boutique's former clients. When Maya asked about the wages she was still owed, Susan said accounting would subtract the cost of damages before considering payment. There was no shouting, no cruel confession. Only procedure being used like a clean hand pushing a poor person outside. The box was set down on the sidewalk outside the back door. Rain began to fall, light but biting cold. The spools of thread inside the box soaked up the water quickly. Maya crouched to pick up the scissors that had fallen out, her swollen purple hand touching the cold cement. Pedestrians walked past without stopping. In Rittenhouse Square, people knew how to avoid looking at scenes that ruined the beauty of the neighborhood. If you are feeling your throat tighten from the injustice Maya has had to carry, and if you believe strong single mothers like her deserve a better ending, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support does not just help this story reach more people. It also reminds us that kindness should not be abandoned when it is standing alone in the rain. And now let's see what Julian Vance will do when the patience of an alpha wolf has finally hit the bottom. Julian found Maya outside the boutique's back door under a narrow awning that only covered half of the cardboard box. He had walked 7 blocks from the hospital after she did not answer her phone. In his hand, he still held the $40 she had given him. One bill was wet at the edge from the rain. He looked at the box, then at her bruised hand, then at the frosted glass door behind her, where the words Laura Bridal glowed in elegant gold. Maya did not cry out loud. She only tried to pick up every item quickly, as if keeping it neat would make the humiliation less visible to others. At that moment, the boutique's front door opened. Chloe stepped down from the entrance with her new fiancé, a younger man than Julian, wearing a cashmere coat of someone who had never been slapped by the world. Chloe saw Julian first, then Maya. It took her 1 second to understand the connection between the bankrupt man she had thrown into the rain and the seamstress she had crushed under her heel. Then the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. She did not need to say much. One glance at Julian's old hoodie, Maya's wet box, and the wrinkled bills in Julian's hand made the contempt clear enough. Her new fiancé asked if they should call security. Chloe said there was no need because some people were born knowing how to drift back to their proper class. The sentence fell onto the sidewalk with the cold rain. Maya lowered her head, but Julian did not look down. He stepped forward, picked up the small scissors, placed them back into the box, and helped Maya stand. He did not argue. He did not make a threat. He only placed his hand behind her back, shielding her from Chloe's stare like a door closing against poisoned wind. But when Julian lifted his head, his eyes were no longer the tired eyes of an unemployed man. They were cold still and exact, like a sentence that has already been signed and was only waiting to be announced. Chloe paused slightly. A very small part of her memory recognized that look. It was the look Julian used to have in boardrooms before buying out a rival bigger than himself. But the image in front of her clashed too hard with that memory. Old hoodie, wet hair, dirty shoes, and loose bills in his hand. Chloe convinced herself that the man had truly fallen to the bottom. She tightened her arm around her new fiancé and stepped into the black car waiting by the curb. Julian took Maya back to the hospital. On the train, she held the cardboard box in her lap, trying to keep the spools of thread from rolling onto the floor. He stood in front of her, one hand gripping the rail, his body blocking some of the train's jerks. Neither of them spoke. The sound of steel wheels grinding on the tracks, the station announcements, and a child crying at the end of the car all blended into the tired sound of the city in the evening. Maya looked down at the peeling soles of her shoes. Julian looked out the dark window where his reflection lay over the black tunnels. At the hospital, Leo was awake, weak but smiling when he saw his mother. Maya hid the cardboard box behind her leg because she did not want him asking why her sewing things were wet. The boy proudly said a nurse had given him an applauds box. Maya sat beside the bed, brushed his hair back, and smiled with a smile as thin as paper. Julian stood at the foot of the bed and watched Leo try to hand the apple juice to his mother first. That child was learning to give up his own portion while he still had to breathe through an oxygen tube. That night, Maya fell asleep in the chair beside the hospital bed, her head leaning to one side, her hand still resting near Leo's arm. Outside the window, rain ran down the hospital glass in long lines. Julian sat on the window ledge, the cheap flip phone beside him. He had not taken his eyes off it for hours. If the operation was not finished, he would keep waiting. If Leo grew worse, he would break every protocol. Power had once been the tool he used to move other people. Tonight, it felt like an animal locked in a cage, clawing against every bar. At the edge of the bed, the hospital blanket over Maya's shoulders had slipped down near her elbow. Julian stood very quietly and pulled it back up without waking anyone. That small movement made him remember the first night, when Maya had pulled her worn coat around his shoulders at the bus stop. Back then, he had been the one testing the world's heart. Now, her world had tested him in return by taking away every reason he had left to delay. Close to 2 a.m., the phone buzzed. The small screen glowed blue in the dark. Julian picked it up before the sound could wake Maya. The message came from the encrypted number of Harold Finch, his private secretary. Only a few lines appeared, but they made the air inside the hospital room feel frozen. Cleanup operation complete. SEC has stepped back. Board access has been locked. The $3.6 billion asset block has been lifted. Where would you like to begin, Mr. Vance? Julian looked at Leo sleeping, then at Maya curled into a hospital chair too small for her, then at the wet Maya, a $40 still sitting in his pocket, the last money a poor mother had given him so he would have a chance at an interview. As his fingers moved slowly, typing one word at a time with nothing extra and no shaking. Start with the hospital, then Laura Bridal, then Chloe. He stopped, erased the last line, and wrote it again in a shorter, colder sentence, one that fit the thing waking up inside him after 30 days trapped at the bottom of society. In the pale blue light of the screen, Julian Vance sent out his first order since returning to power. Crush them all. Harold Finch's message came while the hospital was still glowing white like a train station near dawn. Julian read it 2 times, then placed the phone face down on his thigh. Maya had fallen asleep in the plastic chair beside Leo's bed, a hospital blanket over her shoulders, her bruised hand resting near her son's arm. Leo was breathing softly under the oxygen tube, his lips less pale now, but his small body still looked lost among the IV lines and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Julian looked at the wrinkled $40 in his pocket, looked at the woman who had given it to him so he could buy a suit for an interview. And for the first time in 30 days, he no longer had to hide who he was. He did not make the call inside the room. Julian stepped into the hallway to the corner near the vending machine, where the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant mixed together. He called Harold through the encrypted line. His voice was low, even, and so cold that his secretary went silent for a few seconds. Julian did not ask for loud revenge. He asked for Chloe's family's credit files, the commercial debt the bank was trying to sell, ownership records for the building where Laura Bridal rented space, boutique security camera data, the insurance report on the diamond clip, and a legal team ready within 6 hours. Over the next 12 hours, the Vance Global machine woke up, not with a roar, but with electronic signatures, bank calls, and purchase files moving through secure servers. A Vance subsidiary bought the bad debt of Chloe's family company at a deep discount. because the bank only wanted to get away from an asset that smelled like risk. A real estate company controlled by Vance bought the commercial building where Alora Bridal was renting. Attorneys sent preservation notices to the boutique, the insurer, and the security company. From that moment on, any erased camera footage could become evidence of a cover-up. Julian returned to the hospital room before Maya woke up. He sat beside the window and tried to keep the face of Jules, the broke handyman with no money. When Maya opened her eyes, the first thing she did was look at Leo, then check her purse to make sure the payment receipt was still there. She asked Julian if he had slept at all. He nodded, even though his eyes felt dry and raw. On the bedside table, a nurse placed a packet of papers about financial assistance. Maya picked it up and read it like someone reading each word on a rotten bridge. She did not know that behind those papers, Vance's medical fund had quietly guaranteed all of Leo's current emergency costs under his anonymous support. That same afternoon, when Maya went back to the apartment to pick up things for Leo, a long white box was waiting in front of the door. There was no sender name, only an ivory envelope. Inside was a midnight blue evening gown, glowing softly like a river under city lights. Not flashy, but tailored so perfectly that Maya's was a handwritten note. Wear it. Tonight I will return what the world stole from you. Maya read the line again and again. She recognized Julian's handwriting from the notes he had written about Leo's medicine times. Suspicion moved across her face very quickly. A man who had no money to buy an interview suit could not have sent this dress. She looked down the old stairwell, then at the apartment door, where her mother's sewing machine no longer sat in the corner. But the phone rang before she could think any deeper. It was the hospital saying Leo was stable and that the nurse suggested she rest for a few hours. Maya placed a hand on the dress, as if touching a promise too large to believe. Julian was not there when she returned to the hospital. He left a message saying he had something to do. That evening, a black car stopped in front of the apartment building. The driver wore a suit, politely called her Miss Caldwell, and said Mr. Vance had asked him to take her to the Union League. That name made Maya freeze. Vance, not Jules, not the man who fixed pipes, carried Leo around the hallway and shared $3 spaghetti with her. Vance, the name that had appeared on the financial news on the wet newspaper in his coat pocket the first night. The biggest finance gala in Philadelphia glowed behind tall windows. Inside, crystal chandeliers shone over white tablecloths, champagne glasses, silk dresses, gold watches, and practiced smiles. Maya walked in wearing the new shoes that had come with the gown, but the bruise was still on her hand. She held the small purse in front of her stomach like a shield. Several women turned to look at her, not with pity, but with curiosity, as if they did not know which social level to place her in. Chloe stood in the middle of the main hall, radiant in a silver dress, holding the arm of her new fiancé. She was telling a group of investors that the luckiest thing in her life was knowing when to leave a sinking ship before it pulled her down. The people around her laughed politely. On the large screen behind the stage, the Vance Global logo was still covered by a black backdrop. Chloe saw Maya from across the room, and her smile instantly turned into a small cut. She whispered something to her new fiancé, then raised her glass as if greeting a joke that had wandered into a palace by mistake. Maya was about to turn back. She did not know why Julian had brought her here, and she had no idea whether she should stay just to be looked at like an accessory in a rich man's game. But at that moment, the lights dimmed. The host stepped up to the podium, his voice moving through the sound system as he welcomed investors, board members, bank leaders, and the press. After a few opening lines, he paused, looked down at the card, then announced the keynote speaker, Chairman and CEO Julian Vance. The wine glass in Chloe's hand dropped onto the stone floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass cut through the room just as the applause began. Maya froze. From the side of the stage, Julian walked out in a black Tom Ford tuxedo, his hair neatly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, his posture straight, as if he had not spent 30 days sleeping on a torn sofa. But when his eyes found Maya, the cold face of the chairman cracked for one small moment. He did not bow to the finance crowd first. He walked down 3 steps, went straight to her, and held out his hand in front of hundreds of watching eyes. Maya did not place her hand in his right away. She looked at his face, at the man she had believed the world had abandoned, and at the enormous secret standing between them. Julian did not force her. He only said very quietly that he would explain everything, but first he had to give the truth back to her. That was not enough to heal the wound of being lied to, but it was enough to make Maya stay. Finally, she placed her hand in his. The bruise on her hand showed under the camera flashes. Julian led her onto the stage, but he did not introduce her as a girlfriend or a lover to soften his image. He told the room that for the past 30 days, Vance Global had been running an internal operation to detect irregular trading, debt manipulation, and shareholder betrayal. His personal assets had been frozen on purpose. The bankruptcy rumor had been allowed to leak in a controlled way. The SEC had been informed and had just stepped away from the investigation after receiving enough evidence. Board members who dumped shares using inside information had been suspended and referred to authorities. The temperature of the room changed without anyone needing to say so. The people who had just been laughing with Chloe began looking toward her. Julian continued, his voice not getting louder, but each sentence made the dinner table stiffen. Vance Global had also purchased the full commercial debt of Caldwell Investment Group, Chloe's family company, after discovering they had used the Vance bankruptcy rumor to take emergency loans and hide losses. As of midnight, every credit line guaranteed through Vance-linked banks would be withdrawn. All debts due would be collected under contract. Chloe's father, a silver-haired man standing near the head table, went from red to gray in the face. Chloe opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her new fiancé slowly removed his hand from her waist, like someone separating himself from a bad investment. But Julian still did not look at her. He pressed the small remote in his hand. The screen behind him changed from the logo to security camera footage. The first clip was from La Aura Bridal. Maya was kneeling on the floor, pinning the dress, and Chloe shifted her foot down onto the back of Maya's hand. A low wave of whispers moved through the room. The second clip showed the parking lot behind the boutique. Chloe removed the diamond clip from her bag, placed it in a side compartment of her private car, and spoke on the phone with Susan. The sound was not clear, but the image was clear enough. The third item was the insurance report filed that same day, where Chloe claimed the item had been lost because of a store employee's mistake. Beside the screens, Vance's attorney explained briefly: defamation, insurance fraud, damage to reputation, and labor harm. Susan, who was standing near the bridal fashion group's table, tried to move backward toward the door. Her phone lit up again and again. The first email was a notice ending Laura Bridal's lease for violating business ethics terms and failing to comply with data preservation requirements. The second email came from the attorney for the new landlord. A Real Security staff member stepped over and asked her to leave the event area to speak with legal representatives. Susan was not dragged away. Nobody needed a scene. She walked out herself under the cold eyes of customers who had once called her by a friendly name. Two plainclothes police officers walked toward Chloe. They spoke quietly, handed her paperwork, and asked her to come with them to give a statement about the fraud and defamation allegations. Chloe looked at Julian as if he had broken the unspoken agreement of their class. Rich people could destroy poor people, but they were not supposed to expose each other in public. Julian looked back at her. There was no pleasure on his face, only an ending. When the thin cuffs closed around Chloe's wrists, camera flashes burst like hail against glass. Maya stood on the stage, motionless. Justice was happening right in front of her, but it came too fast, too large, too bright. The woman who had held a cardboard box in the rain yesterday was now watching the people who crushed her being pulled from the hall under flashes of light. Part of her wanted to breathe in relief. Another part realized that the man standing beside her had hidden an ocean under the name Jules. He did not only have money, he had enough power to buy an entire building, lock credit lines, place camera footage on a screen, and change other people's lives with one nod. Julian turned to her while the noise was still rising. He lowered the microphone as if he did not want the whole room to hear the most private thing. He said he was sorry for lying, but he was not sorry for protecting her. Maya looked at him, her eyes wet but not softening right away. She remembered the $40 in his hand, her mother's sewing machine in the pawn shop, Leo lying under an oxygen tube, and the night's Jules had fixed the heater with scratched hands. Then she looked at the chairman of Vance Global in front of her, the man who could have ended her suffering sooner if he had chosen to reveal himself. She pulled her hand out of his. The whole room thought that moment was only shock. Julian understood immediately that it was a wound. Maya stepped back half a step, the midnight blue gown trembling slightly under the lights. She said nothing into the microphone. That silence hurt Julian more than any accusation. He had returned her honor in front of the world, but he did not yet know whether he had lost something more important inside that small hospital room. The trust of the woman who had saved him when he had nothing but a false name and a freezing body. Reporters began calling Julian's name. Police led Chloe toward the side exit. Susan disappeared through a side door. Investors stood, some clapping, some calling lawyers, some looking at Maya as the true center of the story. Julian stood in the middle of the stage. His full power returned beneath his feet, but his hand was empty. Maya turned and walked down the steps of the stage. Camera flashes followed every step. Julian did not immediately chase her. He knew this was not the time to use more power. This was the time for a man who had once controlled whole markets to stand still before the pain he had caused. But as Maya passed the front row, she stopped because the phone in her hand lit up and buzzed. A text from the hospital appeared on the lock screen. Leo is getting worse. Guardian needed back immediately. Maya turned sharply and looked at Julian. In her eyes, anger, fear, and forced dependence were pressed into one cruel choice. She had just learned that he had lied to her for 30 days, but he was also the only person in this room who could save her son immediately. Julian looked at the message, then at Maya, and all the applause suddenly meant nothing. Justice had exploded on the stage, but at the hospital, Leo's small heart was still waiting for a decision that money, truth, and pride could not make any lighter. Maya did not wait for Julian to say anything else. The hospital message glowed on the screen like a thin blade, cutting through the applause, the lights, and the victory that had just exploded in the room. She moved quickly down the aisle between the banquet tables, one hand holding the gown so it would not catch on her heels. Julian followed her, not calling her name too loudly, not trying to pull her back in front of the press. He knew one wrong gesture right now could turn her fear into a performance for people who liked watching others fall apart. The black car sped away from the Union League in the light rain. Maya sat close to the door, her phone on her lap, her eyes fixed on the screen. Julian sat beside her in the perfect fit tuxedo that now looked painfully unfamiliar to her. He called the hospital, put the best pediatric cardiology team in the Vance Medical Network on standby, and ordered every cost to be guaranteed immediately under the name of an emergency medical fund. His voice was calm, exact, powerful. That was exactly what made it harder for Maya to breathe. The man who once said he had no money to pay for a $3 plate of spaghetti was now giving orders to an entire hospital with only a few short sentences. When they arrived, Leo had already been taken into the intervention unit. Maya ran to the nurse's station, her new shoes slipping slightly on the wet hospital floor. A cardiologist explained quickly that Leo's heart rhythm had become dangerously unstable, that he needed emergency intervention and might need surgery sooner than expected. Maya kept nodding, but she was not sure she heard everything. She signed the treatment consent forms with the hand that was still bruised. Julian stood half a step behind her, not touching her shoulder. At that moment, he could buy the entire hospital floor, but he could not sign in place of a mother. The procedure lasted more than 4 hours. In the waiting room, Maya sat with her back straight in a plastic chair, the midnight blue gown falling to the floor like something that did not belong there. Nurses walked past and looked at her, then at Julian, then at the electronic board on the wall. Julian placed a cup of water in front of her. She did not drink. He handed her a tissue. She did not take it. In the end, he sat in the chair across from her, keeping enough distance so she would not feel surrounded, but staying close enough that if she fell apart, he could catch her. When the doctor came out, Maya stood before he even called Leo's name. The procedure had stabilized the boy's heart rhythm, but he needed surgery to repair a valve and correct part of the heart structure as soon as possible. The success rate was promising if it was done at a specialized center. Julian immediately said Vance Children's Cardiac Institute had already prepared an operating room. Maya turned and looked at him. That hospital name was on the screen behind the doctor, on the folder, and on the card of the medical coordinator who had just appeared. Julian's entire world was suddenly everywhere, right in the moment when her son needed saving the most. Leo was moved to recovery a few hours later. He slept deeply, his small face still pale, but his breathing had become steadier. Maya stood beside the bed and touched his hand very lightly. Julian stood outside the glass door and did not step in until Maya turned to look at him. She did not cry. She only asked in a hoarse voice if anything from the past 30 days had been real. The question was not loud, but it made Julian lower his head as if he had just received a sentence. He said the apartment was real, the spaghetti was real, the nights watching Leo were real. The way he loved seeing her place her hand on her son's chest to count his heartbeat was real too, but he had hidden his name, hidden his money, and hidden the whole trap he had built. Maya listened to all of it, her eyes still on Leo. She told him poverty was not a costume rich people could wear for 30 days and take off when it became inconvenient. Julian did not argue. He only said she was right. The next morning, after Leo was moved to a private room, Julian took Maya down to the hospital parking garage. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still wet and reflected long white strips of light. He opened a leather briefcase and took out 2 sets of documents. The first was a lifetime medical trust for Leo, created in the boy's name, managed by an independent board, and not dependent on whether Maya forgave Julian or not. It covered medicine, surgery, rehab, and every future part of his heart care. The second was the incorporation paperwork for Maya Caldwell Bridal, with startup capital, a sewing studio, employee insurance, and terms clearly stating that Maya kept creative control and majority ownership. Maya looked at the documents, then at him. She did not touch them right away. Julian said he was not trying to buy her forgiveness. He placed the contracts on the hood of the car and stepped back so she could see that everything could still exist, even if she chose to walk away from him. Then he pressed the button to open the trunk. Inside, her mother's old sewing machine sat neatly on a soft blanket. The black case had been cleaned, the chipped paint had been left exactly as it was, and the metal wheel shone under the parking garage light. Maya lifted a hand to her mouth. Everything she had held inside since the gala, since the waiting room, since the question of what had been real, finally broke open in front of an old object that could not speak. That machine was not a diamond. It was her mother's hand. It was the nights when she had learned her first stitches. It was the thing she had sold to buy more time for Leo. Julian stood beside the open trunk, his voice lower now. He said he was not sorry for being rich. He was sorry for letting her and her son stay in that cold for so long while he'd been so close. Maya stepped forward, touched the sewing machine, then turned and hit him lightly in the chest with a shaking hand. The hit was not hard, but Julian stood still and accepted it. She hit him again, and this time tears spilled over. Then she pressed her forehead against his chest, not like someone who had forgotten everything, but like someone too tired to stand alone for one more minute. Maya's forgiveness did not come immediately in that parking garage. It came slowly through the days Leo stayed in the hospital, through each time Julian sat outside the operating room with her without demanding that she speak, through the way he let her lawyer read every contract before she signed. Leo's surgery happened 1 week later. Maya wore an old sweater, not the evening gown anymore. Julian sat beside her in the waiting room, his hand open on his knee. When the doctor said the surgery had succeeded, Maya folded forward and covered her face with both hands. Julian did not hug her right away. He waited until she turned toward him herself. In the months that followed, life changed direction, but it did not turn into a cheap fairy tale. Chloe and her family had to sell the mainline mansion and move into a much smaller apartment in the suburbs, facing lawsuits, due debts, and financial investigation. Susan lost the boutique after Elora Bridal's lease was terminated and the high-end clients pulled away all at once. She did not disappear from society. She became a warehouse manager for a discount retail chain, where for the first time she had to stand through full shifts and hear other people call her name over a walkie-talkie. Maya did not instantly become the queen of fashion. Her first sewing studio was inside a renovated brick building in North Philadelphia, with 12 sewing machines, large windows, and a written rule posted on the wall saying no employee had to kneel at a customer's feet to be humiliated. She hired several seamstresses who had once been forced by Susan to work overtime, paid them clear hourly wages, and gave them insurance and sick leave. Her mother's sewing machine was placed in the design room. It was no longer used every day, but each morning Maya still touched it before opening the order book. Leo recovered slowly but steadily. The first time he ran across the grass at the Vance estate, he only made it a few steps before stopping, both hands on his knees, breathing and laughing at the same time. Maya stood on the porch, one hand unconsciously placed on her own chest, as if she were checking his his heartbeat from a distance. Julian walked slowly behind Leo, not rushing him, not picking him up too soon. When the boy turned back and shouted that his heart could run now, Maya had to hold the wooden railing. That entire wide garden suddenly became small, holding only the sound of a child's laughter she had once feared she would never hear outside a hospital hallway. As for Julian, he was still a man of major meetings and major signatures, but Vance Global no longer operated the same way. He created a medical support fund for the children of low-wage employees, opened a legal program for exploited service workers, and added ethics clauses to every lease contract under the company. Some board members called it emotional. Julian only placed the next quarter's profit report in front of them and asked whether they wanted to argue about compassion or numbers. No one said anything after that. Maya and Julian did not get married right away. She needed time to love the real man, not only Jules from the old apartment, and not only Julian Vance from the golden stage. He had to learn how to tell the whole truth before using power to fix anything. Some nights they still argued, especially when Julian tried to solve every problem too quickly with money. Maya reminded him that money could open doors, but it was not allowed to step over people without asking permission. Julian learned that slowly, like learning a language his empire had never taught him before. You know, when I look back at this story, I don't think the most memorable thing is the $3.6 billion or the shining gown or the moment Chloe dropped her glass in the middle of the gala. Those things gave justice a shape, but they were not its soul. What stays longest is an exhausted mother taking off her only coat for a stranger at a time when she herself didn't even have enough money to buy a full bottle of medicine for her son. We live in a world that is very good at pricing people by their bank accounts, houses, titles, and whether they walk through the front door or the back door. But when the storm comes, what saves a person is not a major contract. It is half a cheap plate of spaghetti, an old blanket, a hand pulling someone up at a bus stop at 1 a.m. Maya did not save Julian because he could become a billionaire again. She saved him because she knew what it felt like to be left outside in the cold. The kindness of people who have been hurt often carries a very strange power. It is not loud. It does not ask to be paid back. It does not need someone filming it to prove that it is noble. Julian gave Maya money, a sewing studio, and a new chance. But Maya gave him something more expensive than any diamond: the belief that people can still be kind when nobody has promised to reward them. If today's story touched you, leave a comment with the phrase, "Kindness will come back," and subscribe to the channel so we can keep walking through stories like this together. And if tomorrow you can make the world a little warmer with one small act of kindness, don't let that moment pass you by.